Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Effective Alcohol Policy Strategies for Creating Environmental Change. My name is Ann Chensky, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I just wanted to go over a couple of things with you. The format today will be recorded and available for viewing along with the PowerPoint slides on the Great Lakes Prevention Technology Transfer Center website. Today's audio will be broadcast through your computer speakers, so make sure that your speakers are turned on and up. There's no call-in number available. You may use the chat box feature throughout the webinar to ask questions or add comments. A Q&A session will be held after the presentation. Our presenter today is Chuck Klevgard. Chuck delivers training and technical assistance to support substance misuse prevention throughout the Midwest. He has supported communities and health agencies as they adopt evidence-based alcohol, opioid, and other substance misuse programs or policies. Chuck also serves as the prevention manager for the Great Lakes Prevention Technology Transfer Center. Chuck has earned his BSW from Minnesota State University Moorhead, and he is a certified senior prevention specialist through the Illinois Certification Board. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Chuck. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Ann. All right. Good morning, everyone. I want to start and give you a sense of the objectives and what we're going to accomplish today in the hour that we have together. These are the objectives. By the end of this hour, we're going to have an opportunity to look at differences between individual and environmental strategies. We're going to look at the range of evidence-based environmental strategies that reduce alcohol-related problems in a community. And then we'll talk about criteria for thinking about whether you're ready or have the capacity to implement these types of strategies. So as you can tell from the title, we're going to talk primarily today about policy. We're going to approach that from the standpoint of policy really is used best in combination with either communication or enforcement. They all go hand in hand. So we'll spend a lot of time in the second part of this webinar today giving you good examples about how to create that synergy between the kinds of strategies that you might be using for communication, education, or marketing that can help sort of do a deeper dive into the impact with using policy and enforcement, and again, creating that synergy along the way. So know that today we're going to give you a lot of information. We're going to go at a fairly quick pace. So we're not going to do a deep dive into any single policy and how it works, but I'm going to give you a resource at the end of this webinar that will allow you to do a really deep dive into looking at dozens of environmental strategies and how they work, as well as sort of a how-to manual per se. You could certainly do a day-long training on how to really effectively identify, write, and implement advertising policy, for example. So we won't go into any individual policy with great depth today, but we hope that we can start the conversation with you in a way that will allow us to stay together. So some of you, if you get to the end of this webinar, we're going to do a quick poll and find out which policies are of interest to people, and we'll then create opportunities for us to work together and to do a much deeper dive into how to deal with and address and implement effectively. I want to start with environmental strategies definitionally, thinking about prevention that's really aimed at changing or influencing community standards. As well as sort of institutions and structures. I think about community conditions is a really good term that I would use. If I'm a coalition person talking about community conditions, so removing some of the jargon, helping people understand the impact of environmental strategies is a good way of doing that. So as a way of kind of recognizing and helping for you, again, as a prevention specialist, to be able to talk to folks that you work with about what they are, helping people to see that they're all around us. So if you're in the chat right now, if you recognize any one of these 9 things in your community, type that number in the chat. So take a quick look at these 9 things. I've seen these things, or I know we have these in my town, my community, my block. All right, while you're doing that, I'll do the fast, quick review. What are these? So as a moment ago, I said policies seek to change community conditions. So the first one is an example of what's called built environments. So communities are working to change the way that they organize land and transportation. Now they do that specifically and deliberately to get people to be physically active, to get people to move, with the hopes of getting people to deal with reducing all kinds of morbidity and mortality, in particular obesity for young people, getting them active. So one is an example of using an environmental strategy that creates a built environment. The second one has to do with messaging and policy. Dealing with vulnerable populations and thinking about affordable housing is another way of changing the way our community is designed, so that in fact we have the opportunities for the most vulnerable populations in our community to thrive. And we think about that in terms of Maslow's hierarchy. We know that if you don't have basic needs, it's hard for you to be an effective parent. So the example of that is also environmental. So 3 is a tax example. This has kind of been a big deal here in Chicago where I live. There was a proposed soda tax. So know that that has the impact of looking at increasing the price for engaging in a behavior as a good way of thinking about that tax. So again, it seeks to change or modify behavior. Number 4 has been around a long time, 5210. That has to do with encouraging folks to eat 5 fruits or vegetables every day, screen time for 2 hours or less, 1 hour of active play, and 0 sugary sweets or sweetened drinks in that case. So that strategy has taken on an amazing amount of impact, been evaluated effectively with regard to not only increasing active behavior, but improving communication between parents and their children, as well as dealing with obesity. So you're hearing again some of the themes here. Number 5, you recognize the speed bump. Actually, 40% reduction in speed. Communities with speed bumps in them have far less likelihood of children being struck by cars. Now again, it's sort of that sort of piece of that's intuitive. We know that from research, a change in the environment like that is something that can actually save lives. So number 6 is an example of using education and marketing to change norms. Lots of folks have seen that. That has led to a huge number of sort of suits in terms of being able to have folks be able to protest and claim where they've been wronged. It also has resulted in change at the policy level federally, at the state, at counties, and lots of corporate policy changes happened as a result of social marketing and media for the movement. 7 is that sort of looking at what you might call a mobile food market to increase the availability or access of fruit and vegetables. We know that that's successful in getting people to engage in behavior change, especially when it's used with marketing and media in combination, so that people understand why they should eat more vegetables and where that food cart's going to be. So walking school buses, number 8, and again, lots of communities doing that, and engineering their communities so that kids begin to walk to school. You all may have grown up and had to walk to school, whereas that's less likely in this day and age, so getting kids to move. Finally, a helmet law, and again, we know something like changing policy, requiring a helmet law, it saves lives dramatically. So states that have recently repealed that saw like 90% helmet usage drop all the way to 50 in just 1 year. So policy extremely effective. So whether you like it or not, or you see it as controversial, we know that these kinds of approaches are highly effective in being able to create conditions in communities that foster behavior change in the right direction. So we're going to talk about 2 types of strategies today, with the emphasis again on environmental, but understanding the difference between individual-focused strategies are those things that are designed to help an individual person, a parent, a family, develop the intentions and skills to act in a healthy manner. If you think about that, the programs that you're familiar with, like Boston's Life Skills, and something that you're teaching in your middle school, dealing with strengthening families as a parenting program, are all examples of individually focused strategies. So this isn't an either-or. In fact, we know from the research, the more you focus in a comprehensive way, both on individual and environmental strategies, the more healthy your community will be. Environmental strategies, again, focus on the environment, creating conditions that support healthy behaviors. So I want to highlight a couple of the differences that I think are, again, ways to give you talking points to share with people. Again, keeping that emphasis on both being important. I don't ever talk about them as either or. The goal of individual strategies has to do with personal control of alcohol and other drugs. the goal of environmental is to also bring in some community control at the same time. So the tools we use for individual have to do with education, support, small group activities. Again, remember to give examples of curriculum, things that we do in schools, things that we do with parents or family members. And again, the tools for environmental work are media, policy, advocacy. Social pressure is the lever of change with regard to environmental strategies. The who does this individual behavior change? Often it's educators, folks in health departments, people who work in agencies that hire and support prevention specialists, students in that case as well. Environmental, often done with coalitions, stakeholders, community organizers. The who does it also is reflective of how that work gets done. We know that people who understand and can influence policy are important to have at the table in that case. So where it fits in the continuum of care, and this is a sort of frequently used way to talk about prevention in terms of health promotion and then looking at populations. It's sort of universal populations or interventions that target the general public and whole population. Our examples of universal selective is more looking at folks who have some risk and indicated where there's already been some behavior. So to think about prevention as being that spectrum all the way up to the midpoint of that continuum, we're familiar with universal direct. We think of universal indirect as what you would think of as environmental. Now it's important in that again, we're talking about this is where that lives in terms of your funder or how you might describe this to somebody. Thinking about using that definition of universal indirect as you're talking about changing context for behaviors. Knowledge and attitudes are still part of the goal in there. And again, it's targeting the whole population. Now, how this work started to come about really started in the late 90s to take hold, whereas regard to sort of major sort of institutions doing prevention began to understand a body of research, and this is just an example of one of the researchers who was promoting environmental work by looking at the elements of community climate. I think where that's relevant for us in prevention is that it helps us to really better understand how these issues interact with each other. So if we think about norms, those are really the things that have to do with the acceptance or rejection of behavior, thinking about attitudes and beliefs. Again, as they represent a norm in a community that impacts the decisions people make. They're directly related to behavior. Availability in this case, in terms of this early research about environmental change, availability was about the availability of tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs, but it was also looking at it from the standpoint of retail availability, looking at it from social availability, meaning getting alcohol or tobacco from family or friends, economic, meaning also looking at and understanding how cheap something is and what's the price that somebody pays for that, and then the perceived availability is the last piece of that in terms of looking at the perception of how easy it is to obtain something impacts the ways in which people make decisions and use tobacco or alcohol. Finally, regulation enforcement is sort of overlapping with all of that. So you see the intersections there is what was critical in our understanding, the complexities in which communities work together and create a healthy environment involve all three of these. And again, so regulations enforcement referring to laws, ordinances, policy, all of those kinds of issues. So I want to take a moment now to talk about why you're here. So if you would take a moment and let us know the most important reason for implementing environmental strategies in your community. So this will give me a sense of how to spend the time in the next 40 minutes that we have together. What are the things that you believe are most important for you? Is it I need to reach more of the population I serve? I want to have greater impact? I want to make lasting change. All the above, great, cool. I see again that we're going to hit on all three of those first ones for sure in terms of what do we know about environmental strategies. First of all, they're broad and efficient. Think of them as in the sense of the fact that compared to an individually focused prevention strategy, you have the potential to reach an entire population and change what we would call collective risk. A lot of us in prevention are used to thinking about risk and protective factors in an outcome-based logic model, for example. Whereas this is a way of dealing with a collective, community-wide risk in a way. So the research is clear that you can have a much broader reach in a more efficient way, so sort of in a cost-effective way. It may take longer to get up and running with these kinds of strategies, but in fact we know that you can have a much stronger and deeper reach into the community. So more substantial effects. I think that, again, the research is clear that if you can be effective in implementing policy enforcement, communication together, that you can absolutely deal with some of what undercuts individual strategies. Let me give you an example. I think that we might have a really strong program in our middle school dealing with curriculum, but it's real easy for us, if we teach resistance skills, to be undermined if our community is unhealthy, meaning if there's a liquor store in every corner and that there are messages all over the community that glamorize alcohol use and that there are no penalties for folks who provide alcohol or sell alcohol without an ID. So you're hearing that individual stuff, while still important, environmental strategies can create a healthier environment. Often more enduring. Again, as talk about the issues of sustainability, know that again, with those effectiveness and those enduring changes, and we use that synergistic effect, putting policy in place is like institutionalizing change. It's a good way of thinking about it. It's that if I work with a group of individuals to teach them some skills, that's great, but I got a new crop coming in next year, I have to do that all over again. Whereas policy and creating a consistent way of enforcing policy changes norms, and it changes the whole community, and it happens on a regular basis. It begins to institutionalize the way we do business that creates a healthier environment for everyone in our community. I'm going to talk about 3 types of environmental strategies today, and again, using a range of approaches. I want to give you a sense about how they work together. So in the second half of our webinar today, we're going to use a lot of examples. We're going to take some questions then and really work through what's happening in your community with local conditions. So we'll start with communication, education. These, again, are strategies that are directly trying to change or reinforce norms. So whether that's tolerance of alcohol sales, dealing with the rightness or wrongness of a behavior, you can use communication effectively to deal with that. Often, again, we're talking about communicating positive health messages, a part of that. Looking at issues with regard to specific strategies, counter-advertising, sort of balancing the message that might be out there about alcohol or tobacco, using media advocacy to really create more effective sort of balancing how to build awareness to support policy. Social marketing being more of a specific strategy to create change behavior, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, and then using possibly social norms. So policy adoption in the middle there is more directly about promoting policies and laws and regulations. Now again, policy has more to do with what your lawmakers might develop and enact, but it also changes those conditions. The reason for policy is typically about holding folks accountable. It's about increasing price. And again, the price for a behavior might also be a consequence. Providing deterrence for using, restricting sales, all examples of policy. And we're going to talk about 14 policies today that we have a lot of strong evidence for. And enforcement being the other side. So the partner to policy adoption is enforcing new and existing policies, laws, and regulations. I think in that same way, we'll talk about regulation in just a moment and make some distinctions. So communication, education, this is stuff you're likely familiar with, whether you thought about these as environmental or not. Public education is that piece that has to do with maybe a PSA, a billboard, or brochure. Social marketing goes a step further in that we're asking for behavior change. Now that's social marketing taking on the strategies used by advertising and marketing experts to begin to create an exchange, meaning that the goal is much more direct. There's an ask in social marketing that isn't there sometimes with just education that has to do with adopt this new behavior or stop engaging in this other unhealthy behavior, and here's why to do it. Here's the exchange. So media advocacy, again, has to do with building support for policy by raising awareness about the absence of policy or regulation. We're saying here's the issue, here's the problem, and the reason this problem is here is because it's not regulated in this way. So that's an example of media advocacy. And media literacy, teaching young people critical thinking skills. Again, so campaigns like the Truth Campaign is very much a sort of media literacy, encourage folks to make decisions, think about what they're seeing, the messaging, and think for themselves in that same way. So moving more directly into policy adoption, thinking about this and giving you talking points again. What is policies? It's standards for behavior that are formalized to some degree. Often they're written as rules, regulations, procedures. I think it's helpful to talk with folks about what the word regulate means. And think of the synonyms. It's a rule or directive maintained by an authority. Now, I think of policy in that way. You have to be really thoughtful about what rule is it and who's the authority. In some cases, changing whether compliance checks with liquor establishments are conducted or not, the authority might be a local licensing agent. It might be a county person. They're guided by state law, but in fact, the actual authority that can change how they do it might be more localized. So I think that thinking about that regulate as a how it's done and who does it as part of that, and then regulate is also a verb in that sense, that the regulation of has to do with the direct control or management are good words to think about using regulation. Now, the example I think people are familiar with and connects for lots of folks is the issue of thinking about tobacco. So the most recent Family Smoking Prevention Tobacco Control Act under the last administration regulates tobacco, and the way that they regulate it has to do with product standards, how it's labeled, how products can be sold and to whom, marketing restrictions, and disclosures of tar and nicotine are all examples of how tobacco is regulated. This sets the stage for us to think about behaviors that we want to change through policy. So examples of policies and how they're organized, typically economic is one of the major ways that policy begins to change behavior. Think about tax. I think economic is also the price of tobacco. We know one of the major deterrents for young people in smoking has certainly been access and availability, but price early on paid a huge contribution to young people not picking up tobacco. So thinking about restrictions on access is another good area of thinking about types of policies. Limits on days in sale, happy hour restrictions, restrictions at public events or home delivery, all examples of policy that deal with restricting access or availability. Location and density is another good example of a type of strategy. A whole cluster of strategies have to do with deterrence, meaning trying to get folks to not engage in an issue or a behavior by creating consequences or increasing the consequences or the social disapproval, using a lever of change that might be pressure in that sense. So the examples of deterrence, social host liability, where there's a criminal or civil liability that's imposed for an adult who serves alcohol, lower blood alcohol for young drivers, something, again, a lot of states have adopted, and now you see that everywhere. And then graduated driver's license, so that there's levels of permissions and privileges that go with driving based on developmental issues. Restricting use, keg registration is a good example of that. Container laws, minimum age of sellers, limiting marketing, all good examples of types of policies. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between policy and enforcement, and we're getting close to wanting to move into those examples. So I'm kind of going through some of this quickly, and again, I mentioned early on, and some of you that joined later into this, that we're going to give you a resource. So don't feel like you need to take notes or feel like he's going really fast. I want to get to some of the examples that show synergy, and we're going to give you that resource at the end of this webinar today that's going to lead you through dozens of policies and enforcement strategies that will include really detailed how do you do that. Where does that live, and how do I find out more how to do that particular thing? We're also going to take some time to find out what you all want to dive deeper into in the years ahead. As this Technology Transfer Center in the next several months and into the summer and fall, we can figure out where the interest is in diving deeper. So this is what I mentioned at the beginning, that policy alone does not imply enforcement. So challenges for us in the prevention field is that we may or may not have access to the individuals, entities, the folks who are in charge of these, and they often live in different places. So sometimes the development of policy lives with the city government or county, but in fact the enforcement agency may be in a completely different building, housed and managed by a completely different set of folks. So having the ability to know that if I'm going to adopt policy, I need to have both partners at the table so that I know that policy reflects what the community norm is. We know that's the other sort of piece about policy that's incredibly important, is that it has to reflect where the community is at. I think that's kind of always a debate and a chicken and egg. Does policy change norms, or do norms finally get to a place that policy then is enacted to reflect the community? I think there's some exchange back and forth, but we know that a policy that's wildly out of sync with community norms is not effective either. So we're going to talk about that relationship that's really incredibly important, give you some examples of enforcement that we will give in our sort of live examples today, thinking about surveillance. Often those are things like prohibiting sales through and looking at compliance checks with alcohol, vendors, sellers, and servers, looking at penalties and fines. Again, looking more directly at over-service enforcement, things like ignition locks, community policing, party patrols, and again, we'll talk about examples of community-level enforcement strategies, and finally, incentives. All examples of enforcement. So, want to pause again, and now we've kind of gone through the meat of the content that I want to give you the foundation of, and we're going to move into this piece about synergy and looking at some examples of community conditions that we could change by a combination of strategies. So tell me, what are the conditions that contribute to underage drinking where you live? Is it access? It's just so easy to obtain. Is it availability? It's everywhere, and everybody believes it's super easy to get. So it's kind of, remember all those different pieces of availability: social, retail, economic, and perception. Is it approval? That people don't seem to care, or they think that underage drinking things always happen, so therefore, it's just part of a rite of passage for young people. Awesome. I see the poll populating. Lots of access and availability questions and concerns, lots of issues with approval. So here's, as we move into an example, I think that what really is helpful to think about the ways that environmental strategies work together. Now this model came out as a causal model way back in early 2000. Some of you have seen this before, and I mention it for that historic piece about why did we begin to shift to look at community conditions. A couple of things. One of the major authors here of this work, in addition to Joanna Berkmeyer, who you might know and who's written extensively about understanding causal models for alcohol at the community level, Harold Holder, one of the big authors of this, worried greatly about the mistakes that prevention folks make by focusing too many things on too many strategies that have little effect. So again, his concern was spending a great deal of time, money, hours on things that may or may not have much of a return. So they sought to really analyze research and to understand what are major drivers, what are things that are most strongly associated with underage alcohol use, which things really have those sort of critical relationships. And you're seeing some of that represented with those more solid lines. They also sought to look at which of these issues, as we think about drivers, retail availability, social, drinking beliefs, and family, school influence, which of them can really be changed? They also sought to look at changeability as a way of understanding a model of where to put your effort. So Harold's fear that we would do the wrong things or do not enough of the things that would matter the most, it drew these heavier lines for us to say that retail and social availability are incredibly important. Family, school, and stuff, somewhat important. Drinking beliefs. And again, in some cases, the line is lighter because there wasn't a ton of evidence at the time that you can change those things in significant ways. So if we're focused on community conditions, not so much about individual at this point. So this model is helpful to look at community conditions. These are some of the things that would help us understand where to put our effort. So let me give you a piece of data that would then lead us into an example to say, what would you do about this? So here we are with an example of what's driving the problem by looking at local conditions and source of last alcohol. So this is a combination analysis that was done by Samsa, Seebisk, and Nizda years ago, and they've repeated this a couple of times to look at how do kids obtain alcohol. So if that's a driver that Harold Holder and that buyer group told us was important, looking at purchasing it him or herself is a concern. That showed up and continues to show up in a lot of communities where folks it's just too easy to go buy it with or without an ID, and that the folks aren't necessarily paying attention enough that people are able to buy it. Purchasing it by someone else, a much bigger concern, almost twice as high in that case. And then who is that happening with? Not related, over 21. So 30% of kids saying that they obtained their last alcohol from somebody older than 21. What would you do with that information? In addition to this, I would combine that with some other ways of thinking about understanding local situations. So what we're going to call underlying conditions. You can call them intervening variables. Again, if you're talking to a coalition or you're working with a group of community folks, I think the idea of dealing with jargon and language that makes sense, these underlying conditions in our community have led to the increase in access, the retail availability of alcohol. That over 21 is certainly a leading indicator. So that's why you see that heavy line there. I know that that's really important in our data. We also found out that folks are not checking IDs consistently. And when I walked into the package store over on Smith Street, I noticed that the person selling alcohol looked like they were about 20 years old. So we know that the first issue, the over 21, the issue you might consider would be to starting with a social marketing campaign. And remember, that's about putting social pressure on that 21-year-old group. There are great examples of campaigns that have specifically looked to developmentally increase the likelihood that 21-year-olds, 24-year-olds, 26-year-olds won't buy, they won't use their ID, and it's about tuning into their understanding of the fact that they can make a really positive contribution to somebody younger than them. So Not My ID is an example of one of those campaigns. This one is, I think, a campaign that's in Australia or New Zealand does a lot with putting social pressure on folks in their early 20s to not use their ID to make a negative contribution to somebody's life. So that would be an example of a communication. We're starting with that to deal with the biggest issue. And now we might be moving into thinking about how you might use a combination of policy strategies to address the other two leading conditions. This is, again, our community assessment pointed to those three conditions. We're now going to do some responsible beverage server training to increase the level of ID checking. We've seen, again, sort of looking at laws or ordinances that mandate server or seller training and, have a significant objective to reduce commercial availability or retail availability. They also minimize high-risk drinking. In some communities, they've even seen changes with regards to drinking and driving and injury with regard to responsible beverage server training. And finally, I think looking at hiring policies, a lot of states and communities have developed and implemented minimum age of alcohol purchase, sell, and server laws. So dealing with policy addresses that condition. Why is that a concern? I think, again, that young people are often closer, especially in a small community, and have friends that are probably 2, 3, or 4 years younger than them, and then that becomes more difficult. So it's not as though somebody who's 21 or 20 or 19 can't be a responsible employee. I think the issue is that we know that from research that when we develop these kinds of policies that have age restrictions about you have to be a certain age to sell or be involved in the sale of alcohol, we know that there's less alcohol being sold to young people. Now let me change the conditions up a little bit and then talk about what would look different. So this community, now we're in community B, the issue is still retail availability. What they found here in this case was a lack of consistent compliance checks. So compliance checks being the use of underage decoys to attempt to purchase alcohol from a retail merchant and then applying it through the licensing agent or the enforcement agent, and then applying some citations or penalties of some sort. So this community said, hey, we just don't have compliance checks happen very often, and they're not consistent. We don't know. They seem to be only focused on a certain number of package stores or bars or restaurants. They're not doing follow-up checks. So even when they find an establishment that sells and that fails the consistent compliance check, they're just not following up with them. Administrative penalties is often how this is referred to in the literature. So administrative penalties is the most important lever of change, meaning that even if you do compliance checks, you do them consistently, you follow up, if there aren't sufficient penalties for retail establishments, then they don't have the impact in that case. So in this case, here's the first step is to think about enforcement. So obviously we need to get those compliance checks completed. We need to make sure that there are penalties in place. And then the other piece, the other partner involved in this issue is visibility. So in this case, knowing that we're going to work at enforcement, we're all going to make sure that we let other retailers know that in fact that you can be caught and you can be suspended, you can have consequences. So you're raising the visibility of enforcement, you're increasing the perception that enforcement happens. The other thing that this does is that when there's a notice of suspension that happens along with enforcement, you're letting the community know that this is an establishment that has been in violation of a policy that's maybe harmful to young people, and they can then choose to spend their money somewhere else. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why visibility is an important ingredient when you're looking at using these strategies together. Now here's again where policy could be a really important partner to create synergy. So if in fact I've done this issue and I've increased the sort of the consistency of checking, I've sort of looked at the issue of penalties, policy could be that I'm going to write a policy that says in our community, in our town, through our licensing agency, we're going to check every establishment twice a year. That could be written policy. That could become something that gets regulated in a very different way. We're going to follow up within 90 days. The literature is clear that if I do find a violation, if I don't follow up with them in 90 days and recheck, that we continue to have a problem establishment, meaning that's the same establishment is likely to have a problem 6 months from now when we check them again if we don't follow up within a reasonable amount of time. So that's policy. We're going to write that into regulation. And finally, graduated penalties, incredibly important. When you see that thick line up there about the potential lever of change, it has to do with deterrence. So the more that's graduated, meaning that the first time you're caught, you're given a citation, and the second time you're caught, you may in fact have to close for 24 hours. The third time you're caught, you might have to close down for a week. And again, it's sort of thinking about that in that sense, and there's lots of good models of graduated penalties that you can use with regard to compliance checks. So let's change up the data of what we found one more time and look at what's driving the condition in this particular set of data. They sought to look at where people are using, where are young people using. So a little bit in cars, that was a concern for this community. In homes certainly was big, and that was not a surprise. But what was a bigger sort of concern, someone else's home. So overwhelmingly young people reporting that they're not using in their own homes, that it's using in someone else's. So found that a bit sort of interesting to think about, that there's a set of homes that are problem homes. So this would be true in a lot of communities, that it isn't in everybody's home that alcohol use is happening. It's in a smaller subset of the population that's either not paying attention, not monitoring kids, or has that lax attitude that some of you reported in that same way. So know that there's use, and you could address any number of these in different ways. But let's look at, again, a set of conditions that you might apply different types of strategies to deal with all the conditions that were bigger problems here. So we know that alcohol at parties, that's the big thick line, that's worrying us the most from that initial look at data. Parents not communicating disapproval was something we found out when we did a deeper dive in this community. And then ease of access to alcohol at home. So each of these conditions, again, could be undermined if we don't address or tackle all three of them. So in the case of easy access of alcohol at home, we think that social marketing is likely a good candidate as a strategy to deal with that. Again, you're looking at changing the condition, getting parents to not only deal with that access, to be aware of it, but you're also trying to get parents to talk to their kids about alcohol. So something like a talk it up, lock it up campaign, using a marketing approach, using exchange theory of getting folks to begin a new behavior, start a behavior, increase a behavior. In this case, increase communication and monitor what's happening with either the refrigerator or the liquor cabinet. So know that, again, that stuff that we know, and how would we create synergy with this community? We'd be looking at doing a social host liability. Remember I said that earlier, that's increasing civil or criminal liability, penalties for folks who end up being apprehended with having served alcohol to minors. Now, in order to do that, have social host liability, you need to have enforcement on the scene. So you're going to use a deterrence policy, something like party patrols, which again sort of engage law enforcement going on site, typically responding to reports of unruly parties as an example of that at the ordinance level language. It's about, again, the objective of party patrols is to limit availability of underage drinking opportunities, is a way of thinking about that. So here's a way, again, and you see the synergy. You can begin to see, if I address all three of these, it's not only 2 + 2 = 4, it's 2 + 2 + 2 = 10. That now we've changed conditions in a way that norms are going to start to shift. We're going to start to see deterrence happening. We're going to start to see communication improving. All kinds of things start to change at the community level when we do all three of these together. I want to offer some examples of why to think about this combination. This is familiar to lots of folks. If you studied Everett Rogers back in the early 2000s, we understand the sort of diffusion of innovation research is helpful to think about why people do what they do. Now, that early research looked at the fact that there are different populations that when regard to looking at and studying the adoption of new ideas, or in this case, for preventionists, where it's not only ideas, it's adopting new behavior or stopping bad behavior, we think that there's still these populations of folks. There are folks who are sort of early innovators. There are folks that are more sort of mid-stage kind of issues with regard to populations, and then there are folks that are very late adopters. So here's how these strategies might fall into that in terms of thinking about getting to the whole bell curve of people. Information education, or show me, there's a whole lot of folks that will begin to change and move behavior with that kind of a strategy. We know that folks that are middle, what we would call sort of early adopters, early majority folks, are very much moved by social marketing kinds of strategies that involve help me. And then finally, there's always going to be a group of folks that we would call late majority or laggards in this case from that research about the diffusion of innovation that won't change until you make them. So that's involved policy and regulation. So if I want to hit 100% of people or try to get as many folks on board with the healthy community approach I have, I may need to employ a whole combination of strategies because different populations respond to different strategies. I like this a lot in being able to kind of make a convincing case for show me, help me, make me, all being important part of a comprehensive strategy. Want to give you some sense about, are we ready? Thinking about what do I need to be effective at doing environmental approaches, in particular policy. Do I know enough about what's driving the problem locally? It's really critically important with regard to policy, communication, and enforcement to really understand and have data on your side. You saw with the two examples I gave you data, you could have easily gone down the wrong rabbit hole if you didn't understand where kids were using or how they were getting it. Sounds like pretty basic information, but the survey looks different from one town to the next. So know that data is really critically important to do environmental work. Capacity is, does my coalition have the capacity? Now this has to do with thinking about, can we be in this in terms of being able to understand the levers of change? Do I know enough about how to develop policy? Do I have the ability to attract the right kinds of sectors in my coalition to be able to have the right partners at the table? Resources and reach, also critical. Does my coalition organization have resources and the reach into the community to think about the kinds of people at the table? So again, to do policy effectively, you'd have to have the support of law enforcement, and you have to have media experts at the table, and you have to have champions who have the power of making decisions, either at your town level, whether that's city government, somebody that's on a board, somebody that sits in an agency that does regulations. And so you're thinking carefully about resources and reach. And finally, commitment. It's not a short-term issue. Doing any of these kinds of changes involve thinking about the long haul. So we need to have the big long view and the long haul to do these kinds of strategies effectively. So we're going to move into this last piece, which has us begin to think about, what do you need? So I want to begin to now ask you, as a group of 70 folks with us today, begin to tell us, if I'm going to take this on, or maybe I'm doing some of it already, what it is that I think might be a hurdle for me. Is it that issue of data? Or I don't have that critical champion. I don't have that power person in my midst. I have significant limits in capacity in any one of those areas that I just mentioned. We don't have the money. We don't have the technology. Resources is an issue. I think with regard to policy specifically, readiness is a huge hurdle for folks. And sometimes folks want to jump into policy and thinking about, remember what I said earlier, that has to be reflective of where community is at. And at times, I think with that, a lot of communities will say, I need to spend a year really using media advocacy to build support so people understand why the need for regulation is there. What's happening? Who's being harmed? How are people being harmed? What's unhealthy about what's happening? What's in it for everybody to say, yeah, let's regulate that. All right, seeing lots there with regard to, I think, the biggest issue around some of those issues of capacity. I mean, I'm encouraged to see folks having champions at the table. It's not the biggest issue for many of you. Some of you having data issues. So clearly we need to spend some time talking about the access and availability of data. How do you get good data with this issue? How do you move into a place where you can use that effectively? So here is that sort of gift I mentioned to you all. So in the last several years, some of you, if you've been in prevention as long as I have, you might remember a wonderful environmental strategies toolkit that was developed by Maya Tech and friends years and years ago in the early sort of 2000s. There was an amazing kit with lots of how-to guides in it for how to do environmental strategies. Now that was updated by SAMHSA just a year ago to look at 14 alcohol policies. It looks at 5 or 6 specific enforcement strategies, and it looks at 4 communication strategies that all have really a decent level of evidence associated with them. So what's in this toolkit for you, and the link is right there, is that there's a description of the strategy. Specifically, there's objectives, meaning like what does that strategy hope to change? What has it been shown to impact? Typical elements, if you think of core component analysis, when we first started learning about curriculum in school, we learned about core components, meaning you must do these 8 sessions in order to have the sort of dose and frequency and reach of a strategy. You have to look carefully at elements. So that's some of what's in there about every single one of those strategies. There's typical elements, meaning those core things that you must do if you want to expect change. Which populations has it shown to be effective with? Look at populations, urban and rural. It might look at populations developmentally by age. Also looks at kind of where this has been tested in the country, suburban and rural in terms of cities. And then specifically what outcomes? Looking at evaluation, rigorous evaluation, peer-reviewed journals. What are the outcomes that have been shown with this particular environmental strategy? And then where do the guidelines live? I think one of the most difficult things that I find people sharing with me about the frustrations they have with environmental strategies is where's the how-to manual? When we decided to do second step with social emotional learning in our middle school, it came with a training and it came with binders and it told us how to create a strategic plan. I don't feel like I got any of that with this kind of work. So know that there are, in many places, really, I think, well-developed guidelines for how to implement that policy, that strategy, that enforcement. So know that there's good guidelines in this toolkit. Finally, recognition. Where does it live on a registry? So with the loss of some of the registries that we've been used to, know that there are still 11 registries that are really effective places to go look for environmental strategies in particular. So there's good guidance in here not only about where to search registries for these kinds of strategies, but for each strategy, there's a guide that tells you which registry it lives on and what level of evidence it has. So if they have a scoring and a different recognition for different types of strategies with regard to their level of evidence, that's all there. And then finally, the actual references. If I want to know the research that proves this works, I can go actually look at those actual articles are referenced here. So this is here for you all to begin to use. We want to invite you over the next several weeks and months to dive into this and to begin to think about, what am I doing? Now, in some cases, you're already doing environmental strategies and you're backing into fidelity. And I think that's reasonable expectation. You're thinking, I didn't know there were core components. Let me go see if I'm doing them. So in that way, use the toolkit that way, even if you're already way into policy or way into a communication or social marketing strategy. Go back and look at what we know about fidelity and outcomes in populations. Here are the 14 that are in there. So while you're here now, this is where we're going to move into the next several months with you all, is that we want to find out which of these policies are you guys really interested in doing a deeper dive into. So while I'm talking about them, I want you to type in to the box that's immediately to the right of the slide, type in your name and up to 3 policies by number that you would really like to have us spend more time together on. So again, you can begin to put those in, and I'll talk to you about them as we walk through. So know that advertising restrictions have to do with policies that limit advertising of alcoholic beverages, anything that exposes young people to pro-alcohol messaging. Again, whether that be outdoor billboards or signage, the objective of those kinds of policies are to reduce exposure to pro-alcohol messaging. Alcohol home delivery restrictions, again, sort of looking at prohibiting, limiting availability of retailers to deliver alcohol to personal residences, again, with the objective being to reduce commercial availability. Alcohol price increases, dealing with raising the limits or unit prices of alcohol as a way of dealing with reducing commercial demand. Alcohol restrictions at community events, lots of that happening here in the Midwest, looking at how we can use policy to control the availability and use of alcohol in public venues, whether that be concerts, street fairs, sporting events. Lots of folks doing that kind of work to reduce the commercial availability. Keg registration, been around a long time, using policy and procedure to regulate kegs, tagging or stickering kegs to engrave an identification number, making it easier for law enforcement to know who it is that purchased that alcohol that ended up in a place where young people used it. The objective to reduce commercial availability, also to, again, sort of use that lever of social pressure. Blood alcohol concentration limits for minors, been around a very long time, looking at this sort of ban youth under 21 from driving, looking at other ways of looking at BAC for young people. Dram shop liability, increasing the liability laws, provisions that allow licensed drinking establishments to be held financially liable. And sometimes that's increasing the knowledge about dram shop, and other times it's about making sure that those penalties are enforced. Graduated driver's license, we've talked a little bit already about that issue. Happy hour restrictions, dealing with putting limits on alcohol price and promotion and sales during specific times of day or year. Limit location and density. We know that as we talked about availability and access and some of the differences, if there's just so much alcohol around, there's an alcohol package store where it's available commercially in my local convenience mart. It's where and how alcohol is sold and how many places that is in my community. The goal of that, or objective of that, is to reduce commercial availability. Minimum age of seller, we talked a little bit about in one of our examples of talking about sort of both seller and server, thinking about minimum age. Minor in possession, looking again at sort of laws that deter, dealing with possession, consumption, internal possession of alcohol by underage youth. There's a whole bunch of policies there that, again, are on the books in most cases federally at the state level. The issue, again, is using that in combination with enforcement is typically the issue. I can tell you I work in Cambridge, Massachusetts in a much earlier part of my career where Harvard is and MIT and 8 other colleges, and found that the city of Cambridge had only arrested 1 young person for minor in possession. So clearly the issue wasn't the law, it was the enforcement issue. So we looked and worked hard at why is that not happening. Responsible beverage server training, seller training. We're also doing that these days with a whole host of different kinds of folks. So managers and owners of establishments can also get trained on effective policy, how to set up issues with regard to not just hiring, but how to manage lights in the parking lot, things that go deeper than just looking at making sure that the sellers have the skills to be able to check and refuse sales. Social host liability we've talked a lot about. I see numbers coming in. I am super excited. I feel like I've got great feedback from you guys. Continue to type in numbers as we're talking here, and know that one of the things we want to do, we're going to go back and analyze this and see what numbers showed up the most, and then we're going to come back to you all and say, here's how we want to serve you. Here's how we want to bring together folks and give you a greater sense about addressing the challenges or barriers that you might be having. So we're going to go back and look at some of those other issues with regard to where you identified capacity issues, design something specifically that helps you get to that. I think evaluating the impact, getting stakeholders to the table is something that's easier for us to work with right out of the gate, but we also want you to help you to think about how to evaluate the impact of these kinds of strategies so that, again, so that you can make the case for them, continue to sell them in a way that they move from regulation or ordinance directly into a policy that can be institutionalizing change. I want to say overwhelmingly that when I talk about policy with folks, a lot of folks are not doing it, and I think that the barriers are often not those bigger challenges about capacity, but in terms of thinking we're busy. I think we've got a lot on our plate. And I hearken back to my colleague who said that his greatest fear about prevention is that we would be investing too many hours and dollars into things that have too little effect. And the idea of adding environmental strategies, in particular policy, to our plates will have all those advantages we talked about, it, extending reach, making community conditions safer and healthier for all, having the ability to sustain and institutionalize a healthier condition in our community is part of that. So know that it's certainly worth the investment. I'm a huge advocate, as you can hear, for using policy, in particular in combination with communication and enforcement. Well worth the challenge and the time it takes to do that. So challenge yourself, challenge your colleagues, get over that we're too busy or this is too complicated. It's certainly worth the effort to do. I see we are nearing the top of the hour, so I want to remind folks about the fact that SAMHSA is again offering Communities Talk Town Hall meetings. If you're a coalition organization, you can receive up to $750 to do a planning, as a planning stipend to organize a town hall meeting. All you need to do is email info@stopalcoholabuse.net, say I want an invitation to register. That gives them a chance to kind of figure out where these town hall meetings are happening and who gets the stipend. Watch the website as well from the PTTC to get more information about that. And we are at a point where we can take some questions. I see a question a while back that has to do with looking at change. Ingrained generational attitudes toward young drinking is a struggle. I think talking about generational or even intergenerational issues with regard to drinking, I think that a lot of communities have used combinations of marketing strategies to deal with that again, a very sticky problem with regard to how hard it is to make those changes. I think some of what we're learning is understanding the newest information about developmental risk, the problems that have to do with learning, ongoing learning problems. I think that there's good research about how to challenge some of that using that whole bell curve, knowing that some people are show me, other people's are make me, is a way of thinking about that how stuck that we can be with some of those attitudes generationally. Community leader involvement. Great examples in terms of having that champion camera beer chugging contest. Very disappointing. Again, at the sort of national baseball level of doing beer chugging. Thinking about, again, there are clear examples as you dive into that toolkit about limits that can be placed on advertising in sports arenas. So whether that's a live activity, you have much more leverage in local conditions than we do on what's happening on national television. So look for those kinds of advertising issues with regard to sports in particular. There's lots in that toolkit that would help you look at that. Talking about the dark arrows and the light arrows again, I think that, remember that has kind of a twofold issue. It has to do with, first of all, looking at the strength of the association of that factor. So if that was availability, retail availability of alcohol, and it had a really strong sort of association to underage drinking. The relationship of availability is really strong in terms of its association with the likelihood of a young person taking up alcohol or continuing to drink. The other thing that made thicker lines was kind of the changeability. So the research that they did in drawing that causal model also looked at, are there prevention interventions for which you can actually change that condition? So again, remember what the authors of that model sought to do was to help you figure out where should I put my dollars, my time, my resources, my effort. So they wanted to not just say, hey, these are the things that drive underage drinking the most. They wanted to also say, with the thick lines, here's what drives underage drinking the most, and here's the stuff that we can change the most likely changeability. So that's the thick and thin lines. The dotted lines don't mean that there aren't strategies there. The dotted lines in some cases mean that those are best dealt with individually. So again, I hope you wouldn't see that some of the dotted lines are things that don't matter. They don't matter at the community level in terms of changing conditions as drivers in the conversation we had about causal issues. Great question. Other questions, go ahead typing into the chat. Folks using positive norms. Awesome dealing with that intergeneration piece. I totally agree. People with billboards, t-shirts, youth groups, awesome. Lots of combination using that synergy together. Donna, there will be slides. I understand that you all will get the slides. You will also get a link to this recording, and know that my plan is to follow up with you all and say, here's what showed up as priorities for us to work on together. So we're going to do a deeper dive. We think that it's important to do more. We did this really superficial scan of here's everything that's important today, but we didn't go deep. We went a mile wide and an inch deep on a whole host of issues. So we know that it's important to do a deeper dive, but we wanted to figure out where to do that dive with y'all. So know that we're going to do that. We're going to follow up with you, not just sending you slides, but we're going to say, here's where we're going to go next. Are you with us? You on board? And Ann, I think I am at the end of the hour.
We are. It has gone very quickly. Just a quick, if you need to get a hold of anyone in the Great Lakes Prevention Technology Transfer Center, these are the contact information, and again, these will be included in the slides. And we are done.
Great to meet you all for the first time. Some of you, some old friends I see in the group is also exciting. Have a fantastic weekend and a great holiday.
Thank you, Chuck.